The twinkling lights strung across the Willow Creek Estates clubhouse were supposed to scream festive cheer. But tonight, they just highlighted the plastic perfection of it all. Fake snow dusted the fake pine garland, and the HOA-mandated red and green tablecloths lay wrinkle-free under platters of store-bought casseroles. Deborah Deb Hargrove, everyone called her Karen behind her back, but never to her face, stood at the head of the long table like a pastel general reviewing her troops. Her twin set was the exact shade of forced politeness. Her clipboard clutched like a holy relic. Neighbors, she cooed in a microphone, voice dripping with that syrupy concern that always preceded a fine. We're here to celebrate community standards. Because without them, were we just another rundown street full of chaos? She shot a pointed glance toward the far end of the table where I sat. Sarah Bennett, the neighborhood's favorite cautionary tale. I'd lived on Maple Lane for 6 years, paid my dues on time, and still collected more violation notices than anyone else. My crime? A wildflower pollinator garden instead of the regulation Kentucky bluegrass mowed to exactly 2 inches. Solar panels that disrupted the aesthetic. One string of Christmas lights last year that exceeded the HOA's 500 bulb cap by 12. Each offense came with a lovingly typed letter from Deb herself, always ending with, "We only want what's best for property values." Dear. Tonight, she was in full form, circling the table like a shark in Lululemon. "Take Sarah here," she announced, gesturing with her pen as if I were Exhibit A. Bless her heart, still refusing to replace that eyesore of a garden. We've discussed this at 3 board meetings. Sarah, the rest of us maintain standards so our homes stay marketable. What message does your little rebellion send to prospective buyers? 28 heads turned. The usual suspects, retired accountant Bob from next door, soccer mom Linda whose lawn was so perfect it looked photoshopped, and the rest of the board nodded in solemn agreement. Bob cleared his throat. Property values dropped 0.3% last quarter. Sarah, 0.3. That's on you. Linda tittered. I mean, it's not like you're working a real job where you could afford to fix it. Last I heard you were still blogging? From home? In your pajamas? The table erupted in polite chuckles, the kind that masked knives. I kept my fork moving through the dry turkey, tasting nothing but the familiar burn of being the punchline. They didn't know I'd spent the last 18 months tracing wire transfers from HOA management companies to offshore accounts. They didn't know my little blog was about to become front-page news in 3 major outlets. They just saw the single woman who dared plant daisies instead of sod. Deb leaned in, voice honeyed. We all make sacrifices for the greater good. Sarah, I had to find myself once, yes. Myself, when my azaleas grew 3 inches too tall. That's leadership. The room murmured approval. I smiled a small, tight smile I'd perfected over years of violation letters. Strategic patience. Arguing back only fed the beast. Evidence. However, evidence was a different weapon. My phone vibrated in my lap for the 3rd time. I ignored it. Deb noticed. Phone at the table? Really? That's a violation of our device policy. Section 4.2. But I suppose rules are only for people who respect the community. More chuckles. Bob piled on. Remember when she tried to install that satellite dish? Took us 6 months and 3 certified letters to get it removed. Some people just don't learn. Linda's husband chimed in, mouth full of stuffing. And she's single. No kids. No one to teach her proper values. It's sad. Really. We're basically raising her. I took another bite. The cranberry sauce was surprisingly good, probably the only authentic thing in the room. My phone buzzed again. Insistent. Deb's eyes narrowed. If that's another delivery driver ignoring our no parking zone, I swear, I finally pulled the phone just far enough to see the screen. The name there made my pulse skip exactly once before I locked my face back into neutral. Not yet. Not until the timing was perfect. The conversation rolled on like a steamroller, flattening me with practiced ease. At least she's not asking the HOA for any special exceptions anymore, Bob announced. That's progress. Deb nodded sagely. We did everything right. Private notices, mediation offers, even a neighborhood watch report on her suspicious late-night typing. And this is what we get. A woman who thinks she's above the covenants. They had no idea how right they were about the typing. 18 months of it. 200 sources. Documents that had already triggered federal subpoenas in 3 states. My little rebellion wasn't about flowers. It was about the cartel of HOA presidents and management firms who'd been price-fixing dues, skimming reserve funds, and colluding to keep residents terrified and compliant. Deb's own signature was on 17 of the emails I'd obtained. But they didn't know that yet. They just saw the disappointment. The phone rang this time, loud enough for the whole table to hear. Deb's face tightened. Sarah, please. We're trying to have a civilized holiday meal. Some of us have professional etiquette. I met her eyes, calm as still water. Actually, Deb, I think everyone should hear this one. Mind if I put on speaker? The room went pin-drop silent. 28 forks froze mid-air. Deb's clipboard trembled just slightly. Be my guest, she said, voice still sweet, but now edged with something colder. Let's all see what's so important it can't wait. I pressed accept. The voice that filled the clubhouse was deep, measured, and carried the quiet authority of institutions that outranked any suburban dictatorship. MS. Bennett? Robert Callahan, chairman of the Pulitzer Prize Board. I apologize for the holiday intrusion, but with the embargo lifting at midnight, we wanted to give you personal notice. Your series on systemic HOA corruption has been unanimously nominated in the investigative reporting category. The cranberry sauce really was excellent this year. I reached for more while the room tried to remember how to breathe. Deb's clipboard clattered to the table. Bob's wine glass tilted, red liquid creeping toward the perfect white tablecloth like evidence itself. Linda's mouth opened and closed in perfect imitation of a guppy yanked from its HOA-approved pond. I kept my voice even, the same tone I'd used for every violation hearing. Thank you, Mr. Callahan. I appreciate the call, he continued, warmth genuine in a way Deb's never was. 18 months, 200 sources, documentation that's already triggered 3 federal indictments, and the resignation of 4 HOA management CEOs. Your reporting directly influenced the pending HOA Transparency and Accountability Act. The board was unanimous. This isn't just journalism. MS. Bennett. This is public service that will save homeowners an estimated $47 billion in inflated fees and embezzled reserves over the next decade. Silence stretched like a rubber band about to snap. Deb's face had gone the color of her forced Christmas sweater, pale pink turning sickly. I could almost hear the calculations spinning behind her eyes. Every fine she'd issued me, every email she'd signed, every kickback she'd accepted now potentially exhibit one in a federal case. Bob finally found words. Voice cracking. HOA corruption? You? But you can't even keep your lawn compliant. I smiled politely. Turns out compliance and truth aren't the same thing. Bob, Callahan kept going, oblivious to the carnage at the table. The Washington Post has been trying to reach you. They want a front-page feature tomorrow. 60 Minutes called about a profile. And your assistant has been fielding offers from 3 major publishers for the book. The working title, I hear, is the HOA you paid for. Netflix acquired the documentary rights last week, 7 figures. They're calling it the expose that proves even the suburbs aren't safe from organized crime. Linda made a small choking sound. Her husband's face had gone from smug to the shade of old drywall. Deb's hands were now white-knuckled around the edge of the table, her perfect manicure digging into the HOA-mandated cloth. I glanced at my phone screen again. Another call incoming. One more thing, Callahan added. The Pulitzer Center confirmed your grant. $3 million over 2 years for the follow-up investigation into defense contractor-linked real estate fraud tied to HOA developments. The board is eager to see what you uncover next. I thanked him again, ended the call, and looked up at 28 faces that had spent years treating me like the neighborhood charity case. The cranberry sauce really was excellent. Mom's recipe? I asked the air, as if nothing had happened. The silence lasted exactly 11 seconds. I counted before the room detonated. Deb's voice cut through first. Shrill now, all pretense of sweetness gone. Pulitzer, you're telling me that weed patch you call a garden was cover for this? I took another bite. No, Deb. The weed patch was just the excuse you needed to keep spying on me. While you were busy measuring my grass with a ruler, I was measuring your offshore accounts. Bob's wife, who'd never spoken above a whisper at board meetings, suddenly found volume. But you never said anything. You just sat there taking fines. I shrugged. You never asked. You assumed the quiet single woman with the messy yard was the loser. Easier that way. Gave you all something to feel superior about. Linda's husband slammed his napkin down. This is slander. You can't just accuse. My phone rang again. I didn't even ask permission this time. Sarah Bennett. I answered on speaker. The new voice was crisp, professional, the kind that made HOA president sweat. Jennifer Walsh, personal assistant to Senator Mitchell. The senator wanted to congratulate you personally on the nomination. Your investigation was instrumental in fast-tracking the HOA reform bill that passed committee last week. He'd like to invite you to the White House signing in January. Also, several Senate committees are already requesting briefings on your upcoming defense contractor piece. Turns out some of those developments were built with federal funds funneled through the very management companies you exposed. Deb's chair scraped backward. Her face was no longer pink. It was the color of guilt. This is my neighborhood, she hissed. You can't. The senator's assistant cut her off without hearing her. MS. Bennett. The senator also mentioned that based on your documentation, the FBI has opened a case into Willow Creek Estate specifically. President Hargrove, if you're listening, you may want to retain counsel. The table erupted into overlapping chaos. Bob was frantically Googling HOA indictment on his phone. Linda was whispering furiously to her husband about selling before the property values tanked for real this time. Deb stood up so fast her sweater caught on the chair, tearing a small hole in her carefully curated image. This is ridiculous, she sputtered. I've served this community for 12 years. I've enforced the covenants that keep our standards high. And now some subblogger thinks she can. My phone buzzed once more. I held up a finger. The same gesture she'd used on me 100 times during violation hearings. 1 second. Deb. This one's important too. I answered. Sarah. It's David Chun from Columbia Journalism School. The board has voted unanimously to offer you the endowed chair of investigative journalism. Full professorship, research budget, the works. The irony isn't lost on anyone. The position was originally funded by a developer who later got caught in the exact HOA kickback schemes you just dismantled. Your grandfather would have been proud if he'd lived to see it. I couldn't help the small smile. Thank you, David. I'll be in touch after the holidays. I ended the call and looked around at the wreckage of what used to be a perfectly compliant holiday dinner. Deb's clipboard lay abandoned. Her face had crumpled into something between rage and terror. The realization that the quiet woman she'd spent years fining into submission was about to become the reason her entire world collapsed. I pushed my chair back. The turkey really was excellent, I said pleasantly. But I think I've had enough community standards for one night. No one tried to stop me as I walked out. Behind me, the frantic whispers began, questions about my work, my sources, my future, exactly the questions they could have asked years ago if they'd ever bothered to look past my lawn. The cold December air outside the clubhouse felt cleaner than anything inside. My phone lit up again as I reached my car. Text from my assistant. CNN, NBC, and the BBC all want interviews tomorrow. Publishers Weekly just announced your book hit #1 on pre-orders. Also, the FBI confirmed they served papers at Deb's house 30 minutes ago. You nailed it, boss. I slid into the driver's seat and drove away from Willow Creek Estates without looking back. For the first time in 6 years, I didn't need to defend my garden, my solar panels, or my life choices. The Pulitzer board had done it. The Senate had done it. The FBI had done it. And next year, if I came back for the holiday potluck, which I probably wouldn't, everything would be different. Not because I had changed, but because they had finally been forced to see what had been true all along. The rule breaker they'd mocked for years was the one who'd just broken their entire system. They just hadn't bothered to read my byline. 3 months later, I stood at the podium in Columbia University's Low Library, accepting the endowed chair of investigative journalism while cameras flashed and my former neighbors watched from the audience via live stream, every single one of them silent for once. Deb Hargrove's face was noticeably absent. She was busy with her own community standards hearing in federal court. The Pulitzer ceremony followed in April. In my acceptance speech, I thanked my sources, my editors, and the handful of neighbors who'd quietly slipped me documents over the years, the real heroes who believed in truth when it mattered. I did not thank the HOA board. Some omissions speak louder than any violation notice ever could. The Netflix documentary dropped in June and became the platform's most watched true crime series ever. My book hit #1. And through it all, the residents of Willow Creek Estates watched from the sidelines, finally understanding that the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served with a Pulitzer, a Senate bill, and the quiet satisfaction of knowing you became everything they swore you could never be while they were busy measuring your grass. Because in the end, the real community standard isn't perfect lawns or identical mailboxes. It's accountability. And I just raised the bar so high. Their entire empire of petty tyranny was never going to recover. Word count 1,000. The federal courthouse steps in downtown Atlanta were slick with spring rain, but the crowd of reporters didn't seem to mind. I stood at the top, microphone in hand, watching as Deborah Hargrove, former president of Willow Creek, HOA former queen of pastel tyranny, was let out in handcuffs by 2 very serious FBI agents. Her twin set was still perfectly pressed, but the clipboard was gone, replaced by an orange jumpsuit in her near future. The flashbulbs popped like fireworks. One reporter shouted, "MS. Bennett, how does it feel knowing your reporting took down the woman who fined you 17 times for wildflowers?" I leaned into the mic, voice calm the way it always had been at those endless board meetings. It feels like justice. Actually, not just for me, for every homeowner who ever got a certified letter threatening their home over something as ridiculous as the wrong shade of mulch. Behind me, the rest of the Willow Creek contingent stood in a tight knot, faces pale. Bob, Linda, the entire former board. They'd all been subpoenaed as witnesses, forced to admit under oath that they'd known about the kickbacks, the inflated fees, the way Deb had used the reserve fund to pay for her lake house. None of them looked at me. They couldn't. The Netflix crew was filming the whole thing for the sequel episode. Everyone was already calling Karen's last fine. My phone buzzed. Another text from my assistant. Senator Mitchell's office just confirmed the HOA Reform Act passed the House. Your name is in the preamble. Also, the Columbia students are already lining up for your first seminar. How to take down a suburban cartel in 18 months. I smiled at the camera. Any last questions? A young journalist from the local paper stepped forward. MS. Bennett. Residents are saying property values actually rose after the scandal broke. Buyers want transparency now. Any comment? I glanced back at the knot of ex-neighbors. Tell them the new community standard is simple. Don't steal from the people who pay the dues. And maybe plant some wildflowers. They're good for the bees. Later that afternoon, I stood in my own front yard, the one that had once been Violation Central. The wildflowers were in full bloom. A riot of color that would have sent Deb into cardiac arrest 6 months ago. My solar panels glinted in the sun. No more threatening letters taped to my door. A moving truck rumbled past. Bob's house had sold in 3 days once the scandal hit Zillow. The new owners had already ripped out the regulation sod and planted vegetables. Change, it turned out, looked a lot like chaos to the old guard. My phone rang. It was Grandma Eleanor, the only person in the entire neighborhood who'd ever slipped me a quiet thumbs up when Deb wasn't looking. I always knew. "Dear," she said, voice warm. "I read every article. Subscribe to the Washington Post just for your byline." That expose was masterful, the way you trace the money through 17 shell companies. And now look at you. I laughed softly. Look at all of us. Grandma. Even the HOA finally learned that rules without accountability are just bullying with better stationery. She chuckled. Deb's lawyer tried to get the judge to dismiss everything. Said it was just neighborhood politics. The judge laughed so hard he had to recess for 10 minutes. I could picture it. The same courtroom where Deb had once testified against me for aesthetic violations was now the place her empire ended. "I'm proud of you," Grandma said. "You never needed their approval. You had mine. And now you have the whole country's." I squeezed the phone tighter. That feels pretty good. Behind me, the documentary crew was packing up for the day. The producer waved. "We're calling the next episode From Violation to Victory. You in for a cameo?" I nodded. Why not? The story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to every homeowner who'd ever been fined into silence. As the sun set over Willow Creek Estates, the neighborhood looked different. Lawns were still mowed, but not to the exact inch. Christmas lights next season would probably exceed the old 500 bulb cap, and nobody would care. The covenants were still there, but now they came with oversight, with transparency, with the very thing Deb had feared most, truth. I walked back inside, past the wildflower garden that had started all. My Pulitzer certificate hung on the wall beside the first violation notice Deb had ever sent me. I'd framed them together, a before and after that no one could ignore. Because the real victory wasn't just the awards or the book deals or the Senate bill. It was the moment the entire table, every single neighbor who'd once laughed at my failed life, had to sit in stunned silence while the truth rang out on speakerphone. It was the slow, delicious realization that the quiet woman they'd spent years belittling had been the one holding all the cards. And now the game was over. They'd lost. I'd won. And the best part? I hadn't raised my voice once. I'd simply let the evidence speak. And it had spoken loud enough to topple an entire suburban empire. 3 months after the arrests, Willow Creek Estates held its first ever transparent board meeting. The new president, an actual retired accountant who believed in numbers instead of intimidation, opened with an apology to every resident who'd ever been fined unfairly. I sat in the back row, wildflower seeds in my pocket, just in case. No one stared at me like I was the neighborhood disappointment anymore. They stared like I was the reason their property values had climbed 8% once the scandal made national news. Buyers want honesty now, the realtor across the street had told me yesterday. Your book is basically the new HOA Bible. Deb's lake house was on the market, for sale to pay restitution. Her pastel twin sets were probably in an evidence locker. The meeting dragged on with actual discussion instead of decrees. Someone proposed changing the grass height rule to reasonable. Another suggested solar panels were now encouraged. I didn't speak. I didn't have to. My work had already rewritten the covenants in ways no clipboard could erase. Afterward, Bob approached me in the parking lot, hands twisting nervously. "Sarah, I owe you an apology. A real one. Not just for the fines, but for years of, well, treating you like the problem. I looked at him evenly. You treated me like the problem because it was easier than admitting the real problem was upstairs in the president's office skimming dues for personal vacations. He swallowed hard. I didn't know. None of us did. We just followed Deb. I smiled the small smile I'd once used at dinner. That's the thing about cartels. Bob, everyone thinks they're just following rules until the rules turn out to be crimes. Linda's husband shuffled up next, looking 10 years older. The Netflix thing, it's everywhere. My grandkids won't stop asking if I was part of the evil HOA. I wasn't. I swear. I just didn't ask questions. I patted his shoulder. Next time, ask. Before you measure someone's grass with a ruler and call it community service. They left me standing there under the same twinkling lights that had once mocked my rebellion. The new board had already approved my wildflower garden as environmentally compliant. My solar panels were now a model for the neighborhood. And my next investigation, funded by that $3 million grant, was already underway. Defense contractors building gated communities with the same kickback schemes. The cycle continued, but now I had the microphone. My phone buzzed. Assistant again. Columbia students are calling you Professor Bennett already. First lecture sold out. Also, the senator wants you at the bill signing photo op, front row. I slipped the phone back into my pocket and looked out over Willow Creek. The houses were still identical on the outside, but inside something had shifted. People were reading my byline now. They were asking questions. They were planting wildflowers. And somewhere in a federal holding cell, Deb Hargrove was probably staring at her own violation notice, this one for a very different kind of rule breaking. I drove home slowly, past the perfect lawns that no longer felt like threats. The best revenge, I'd learned, wasn't loud or flashy. It was quiet, patient, and backed by 200 sources and a Pulitzer committee. It was letting the truth do the talking while the tyrants scrambled to rewrite their own history. And it tasted better than any HOA-mandated casserole ever could. Because in the end, the quiet resident they tried to silence had become the loudest voice in the room. Not by shouting, by simply refusing to stay silent when the evidence finally spoke. And the entire neighborhood, once ruled by fear and clipboards, was finally free.